Would you like to get more power from your home theater system? Well, if so, this episode is for you. It's relatively trivial to add a home theater, home hi-fi power amp to your receiver to get more power. So I'm not going to cover that in this video. Instead, I'm going to take it up a notch, go one step further, and talk about how to interface professional sound equipment, a pro sound amplifier, to your AV receiver, and how to do it in such a way that gives you the maximum possible performance. This is my home theater receiver. It's a good unit, does everything I need it to do, and I've been pretty happy with it. But it could always have more power, right? Well, that unit has about 85 watts per channel, maybe 100 watts per channel. And do I think that it will make that spec? Probably. I haven't measured it, but it's made by Yamaha, and I've had pretty good experience with Yamaha equipment. So I anticipate that it would probably make its spec. Now, will it drive full power into all of its channels at the same time? Well, that's a bit more dubious. That thing is pretty heavy, it's pretty stout, and some bigger receivers will actually deliver full power to all channels simultaneously. But a lot of them won't. A lot of them just don't have enough power supply to deliver that much power continuously to all of their channels at the same time. And does it matter? For me? No, it doesn't matter. It works perfectly fine. When I watch movies with that receiver, they sound great. It gets plenty loud. I've got no need. It works perfectly fine for me. But for some people, it might not. Or some situations, you might want more power. Now, could we go into that unit and modify it to give us more power? Well, if it was an automobile, we could go into the engine and help the engine breathe by working on the intakes and the exhaust, maybe do some ignition timing changes, deal with the fuel injection system to give it more fuel, maybe even put in oversized pistons, and we could get more power out of the existing engine. But in the case of that receiver, going in there and modifying the electronics to give us more power, it's probably not practical. There just isn't much room in that box to add any additional components, and the power that it can deliver is pretty much baked into its design. Trying to get much more out of that receiver would require a pretty significant modification. It would be somewhat like trying to make a Volkswagen Beetle into a semi-truck. I mean, anything's possible, but some things just aren't very practical. So the practical solution is to add a power amplifier to that unit to drive our speakers. And fortunately, with this unit, if we look at the back, we have connections back here for external amplifiers, preamp outputs, and a lot of hi-fi receivers offer those connections, which would make this task easier. So let's talk about some of the scenarios in which you would want to add a power amplifier to your home theater system. The first one that comes to mind is I've got a friend who throws some pretty epic pool parties, and he puts speakers outside, and he's also got speakers playing inside, and he cranks up the tunes pretty loud. And over the course of the evening, I've seen multiple times where his receiver has just thermally tripped out and shut down into protection mode, because driving all of those speakers for that long at that high a power level is just really stressful in the equipment, and it's a little more than his receiver can handle. So he'd be a perfect candidate to hooking up an external amplifier to drive those outdoor speakers. Another application similar would be folks who do backyard theater. You put a projector in the backyard, some speakers, and broadcast a movie to your family and friends. And filling up the great outdoors with sound can take a lot of power. Now, of course, if you're going to do this sort of thing, make sure to consult your lawyer first, because there's legal issues surrounding the public performance of licensed material such as music and movies. So I'm no lawyer, don't sue me, bro. I'm just saying that before having fun, check with your lawyer to make sure that you're not violating some code or some law. Another situation where you might want an external amplifier would be if you want to add more speakers to your system. Maybe you're already driving 2 pairs of speakers or a pair of speakers that is rated at 4 ohms, and that's the maximum amount of load that the receiver can easily handle. And if you want to add more, well, then another power amp is in order to drive those additional speakers. Maybe you want to add another set of speakers and you want to be able to adjust the relative volume level between the speakers that are attached to your receiver and the ones that you've added on. So if you have a secondary set of speakers that are maybe in your backyard, for example, and you want them to play louder than the speakers that are inside the house, you want to be able to adjust those relative volumes between the different sets of speakers. And if you attach an external amplifier that has gain controls on it, that'll allow you to have those sorts of adjustments. Maybe you're driving a set of speakers that are difficult for amplifiers to drive or are fairly inefficient. Some speakers, because of their electrical characteristics, present a fairly easy load on amplifiers. But some audiophile speakers present a very difficult load on amplifiers, and they don't sound right unless they're attached to a really good, strong, powerful amplifier that can handle that sort of dynamic load. And so in that case, driving those speakers with their own amplifier may result in better sound. Or maybe your additional speakers are just very inefficient and they really need a big amplifier to do their best. Or maybe you're like me and that you have this belief that big, high-powered amplifiers just tend to sound a little better. And that's because music has these big transients in it. When the kick drum smacks, that's a big spike of energy that's kind of come out of the system in a very short period of time. And having an enormous amplifier with tremendous reserves can handle those sorts of peak demands without stress. And so they're able to very accurately represent those peaks in the music. And they have enough power to make your speakers respond instantaneously to those peak demands. And so a big, powerful amplifier, although it may seem like overkill, may actually sound better. So what amplifier should you get? Well, there's a whole lot of amplifiers in the market, and this isn't the place for me to start talking specific amplifiers. So I'm going to talk in general terms. Now, when we talk about an amplifier, probably the first thing that we mention is how many watts is it rated for? How much power does it have? And are watts always watts? So let's do a little segue here and talk about trucks. When I compare one truck to another, I'm curious about how much horsepower this one has versus the other one. How much power does the truck have? And 1 horsepower happens to be about 750 watts. Let's divide the world of trucks into 2 categories: consumer trucks and commercial trucks. A consumer truck would be a pickup truck that you find at your local home improvement store. And these are good vehicles made for consumer use. And when manufacturers design these vehicles, I think that they pretty much intend for the vehicle to be used more or less as a passenger vehicle, with enhanced payload and towing capacities. And in a typical pickup truck, you can probably put between 1,000 to 2,000 pounds of payload in the back end of it, and you can haul a modest-sized trailer around effectively. And they work well for that. And so people use them for occasionally hauling loads or trailers around. and mostly for just driving around. Now, I know there are some contractors who make pretty good use of their pickup trucks. But if you were to put 1,500 pounds of load in the back of a pickup truck and operate it as a commercial vehicle doing deliveries 8 hours a day, every day, I think that you would prematurely have issues with the suspension, the drivetrain. Things would wear out. On the other hand, if you take a small commercial truck, the commercial truck can handle maybe 10,000 pounds of payload. And so you could put 2,000 pounds in that commercial truck and drive it around all day, every day, and not have any problems with the suspension or drivetrain or anything like that. It would easily handle that load. Now, the thing is that that pickup truck probably has about 250 horsepower of engine in it. And if you were to put the pickup truck on a dyno and actually check how much power it's got, I suspect it would probably actually deliver its 250 horsepower. Some trucks with a big engine probably have even more power than that. Now, on the other hand, this commercial truck, that has an engine that's rated at 210 horsepower. It's actually got less power than the pickup truck, but it's got a lot more capability because it was just designed overall to be a lot more heavy duty. And that's how I see the world of commercial pro sound power amplifiers versus consumer amplifiers. They both might be rated at the same power level, but they might not really be the same beast. The pro sound power amplifier is designed to be run hard for long periods of time in commercial applications. It's most likely designed to handle stagehands and roadies doing dumb things like putting ridiculous loads on the amplifier and not having the amplifier blow up when you turn it on. So it's probably got better protection circuitry or just simply the built-in current drive to be able to say, a 1 ohm load tonight. Well, I guess we're going to do that. And it can do it. The commercial power amps are likely to survive being dropped onto a concrete floor because they know that they're going to be put into situations where those sorts of things can happen. A consumer power amp, on the other hand, might be rated at the same amount of power, but it's intended to be used in a much more gentle application where it's probably not going to be driven to those high levels of power for really long periods of time. So it may not have quite the same thermal dissipation abilities. It may not have the same level of protection circuitry for dealing with difficult or bad loads that are attached to the amplifier. And so I'm somewhat attracted to going down the route of a pro sound amplifier, which is a more heavy-duty and rugged device. Now, of course, I'm talking in generalities. If I made a statement like, I wouldn't be comfortable running a rock and roll band show with hi-fi consumer-level power amps, somebody might come back at me and say, well, you know, the Grateful Dead did that for years with those Macintosh power amps. Well, that's true. And those Macintosh consumer power amps were beasts. So you'll find examples of some really great equipment in both categories. And you'll also find some examples of equipment that isn't so great in both of the categories. And likewise, there are people who would say, well, a home theater, home hi-fi power amp has been designed for really good, high-quality, refined audiophile level sound, whereas those commercial power amps are more concerned about being heavy-duty and rugged, and they don't sound as good. Well, I would take issue with that. Again, I think you can find examples in both the consumer power amps and the pro sound amps of some amps that sound really good and some that are a little bit lacking. But speaking overall, in general terms, especially of equipment that's been designed in the last couple decades, designing a good high-quality power amp is not an engineering feat these days. And I think that the designers who are working at major companies like QSC and Yamaha, PowerSoft, all of these major Crown, all these major amplifier companies, they have really good engineering staffs. And I think that they know how to build good sounding, rugged, high quality pieces of equipment. Now, another objection might be that while a commercial power amp is a really heavy duty, rugged piece of equipment made for commercial duty, that's going to be expensive. Yeah, they can be. Likewise, the home hi-fi power amps, they tend to be marketed into a niche market. Not a lot of people are buying those pieces of equipment. And the folks who do buy that kind of equipment tend to be folks who care and folks who have some money. And so they are marketed as a premium device. And so they tend to go for pretty high money as well. And there's not a whole lot of them being manufactured compared to the commercial power amps, which are used in all sorts of applications, and there's a good number of those units on the market. And so I think when you look at the used market of equipment, you'll find that the commercial power amps can often be had for pretty low money, especially compared to home hi-fi power amps. And so if you go to your music store that sells used music equipment, chances are you can probably find a really high quality, big commercial power amp for pretty cheap. And so I think that there's some good value there. So I think you can get a heavier duty piece of equipment for less money in the pro sound commercial power amp space, generally speaking, than you can find in the home hi-fi, home theater market space. And so for those reasons, I tend to migrate toward the pro sound equipment. I think it's just more rugged and it will deliver more. Especially if you need a situation where you need lots of power for a long period of time, like my friend who's throwing his pool parties, for example. Now, the trouble with connecting a pro sound power amplifier to your home theater system is that the connectors are different and the signal requirements are different. And so let's talk about that next. If you look at the back of your AV receiver, chances are you'll find some preamplifier output connections. And if you don't have those preamplifier output connections, well, maybe you need to find a receiver that does. But assuming you have that, if you wanted to connect to a consumer level amplifier, it would be simple. Just run a cable from those preamplifier outputs to the input of the amplifier, connect your speakers to the amplifier, and there you have it. But if we're going to hook up a pro sound amplifier, well, the signals are a little different and the connectors are a little different. The connectors on your AV receiver are RCA pin jacks, and they are at consumer hi-fi minus 10 dB level, and they are intended to drive a high impedance load. The connector on the amplifier, on the other hand, is going to be, most likely, a 3-pin XLR connector, or a CAN connector. Some amplifiers may have a 1/4-inch phone connector, which is also a 3-conductor connector as well. And electrically, a 1/4-inch phone jack or an XLR connector would be the same thing. They both have 3 conductors and the same signal. I prefer using the XLR connectors. I consider them to be a little bit more professional. Now, on that XLR connector that's going into the power amplifier, there are 3 lines. There's a ground on pin 1, there's positive audio signal on pin 2, and negative audio signal on pin 3. It's a balanced connection. And the reason for doing this is it allows us to pass signals over long pieces of wire without electrical interference. The amplifier is actually looking for the difference between the signals on pin 2 and 3, and it's not really using the ground conductor as a signal reference. Whereas in the hi-fi world, it uses the ground and 1 signal line, which is more suspect to interference. In addition, the Pro Sound amplifier has a low impedance input. By spec, that would be 600 ohms. In practice, it might be 600 to 1,000 ohms, but it's relatively low impedance. So that means that the signal needs to be pushed with a little bit of force into that input. And that way, any stray static that comes along doesn't have enough energy to really drive itself into the amplifier, and it reduces the noise in the system. But that means that the equipment that's driving that professional power amplifier has to be able to deliver a little bit of energy, a little bit of power on that signal line to drive the signal with some force into that amplifier. It's got a low impedance input. It doesn't impede the flow of electricity. It takes the flow of electricity. Whereas your home AV receiver is a high impedance output, and it's expected to be connected to a high impedance device. And so we have two things working against us here if we were to just run a straight cable from your AV receiver into a Pro Sound piece of gear. One, the signal is not balanced, so we can only drive one of the two signal lines. And we could do this in a pinch by grounding one of those signal lines. We could tie pin 1, the ground, to pin 3, the negative signal conductor at the amplifier, and then just drive the audio signal into pin 2. And so we could get a signal from your receiver into the Pro Sound power amp. And then there's the signal level difference. The AV receiver is expecting to drive signal at minus 10 dB at maximum level, whereas the amplifier is expecting a signal at, plus 4 dB perhaps. So there's about a 12 dB difference in signal level from what the AV receiver puts out versus what the Pro Sound amplifier is expecting. So that means that the volume control in your AV receiver would probably be turned up pretty high in order to get reasonable amounts of output out of the attached amplifier. And then we have the impedance mismatch, which is your AV receiver has a high impedance output, which is not designed to drive any significant load, and the amplifier, which applies somewhat of a load onto whatever equipment is driving it. And so because of that, your receiver may not very effectively drive that load. It may cause the output circuitry in your receiver to distort when trying to drive a load that's much heavier than it's anticipated, or it may reduce the signal level even further because it just can't drive much into the load that's being presented to it. And so just using a jury-rigged patch cable between your home hi-fi system and a Pro Sound amplifier, it's not a good choice. What we need to do is we need to convert the signal that's coming out of your AV receiver to the kind of signal that a Pro Sound piece of equipment is expecting. And there's a number of products out for doing this. Here's an example of one, which is a unit that's unfortunately no longer in production, but it's a little box like this, which is a signal amplifier. Now, when I say an amplifier, I don't mean a high-powered amplifier that's able to drive loudspeakers, but it just boosts the line level signal a little bit. And you'll see that it's got RCA inputs, the kind of inputs that your receiver can drive, and a pair of 3-pin XLR type connectors, which is an output that can drive Pro Sound gear. So it takes in the input signal from your receiver or consumer equipment, and it boosts the signal up a little bit and drives it out in a low impedance output for driving Pro Sound gear. And there's a number of these boxes on the market. The one that comes to my mind is the Clean Box by Art, which is a popular unit. And so this is the unit that you need to interface your consumer equipment to Pro Sound equipment. And so with this, we would just take the signal from your receiver, take the output from this box into the power amp using XLR connectors, and you will get clean, clear, powerful signal from your AV receiver into your power amp. And with this and the signal that it provides, which is a little bit boosted, it means that the volume control on your AV receiver will be at a reasonable position for the amount of output that you expect from your loudspeakers when driven by that external power amp. Let's talk about all the pieces that you're going to need to get this stuff hooked up. and getting your speakers connected to your power amplifier. Now, in the description below underneath this video, I'm going to leave some links for you to Amazon, which is an example of all of the different pieces and parts that I'm talking about here. You can, of course, get those parts through Amazon or through any other reseller that sells audio equipment. As I mentioned, you're going to need a converter box to convert your high impedance consumer level signals coming out of your AV receiver to a low impedance balanced signal to drive your power amp. And the output of that box is going to be a 3-pin XLR connector, and the input to your amplifier is also a 3-pin XLR connector. One's a male, one's a female, and so we're going to need a patch cable like this right here with a male connector on one end and a female connector on the other end, and enough length to get between your pieces of equipment. This cable is otherwise known as a microphone cable, although you might not need that much length. So you need to get 2 microphone cables or patch cables to go between those pieces of gear, between that converter box and your power amp. This cable here is about 6 feet long. And then to get from the power amplifier out to your speakers, we need to make that connection. Now, if we take a look at this older power amp, this is a little QSC power amp, you'll see that it has 5-way binding posts. These red and black connectors right here. And this is the output of the amplifier that goes to the speakers. Now, you could unscrew the top of the binding post and insert your wire into there. And there's a little hole that the wire goes into, and then you can tighten this back down and just attach bare wires to it. I don't recommend doing that because it's easy for you to get a little stray strand of wire that shorts out against the other post. And so if you use bare wires, you have to be very careful to make sure that there are no little stray strands of wire that are going to cause you trouble. In that event, what I'll often do is I will twist all the conductors together nice and neat, and then I'll touch that wire with a soldering iron and just a little drop of solder to make sure that all of those conductors of the wire, all the strands of wire, stay neatly together and they don't fray when you put them into the connector. I think a much better approach is to put a banana plug on your wires, which will then just plug directly into these connectors right here. And that way it's easy to connect and disconnect the wire, and it's easy to make sure that you get the polarity correct, because the double banana plug will have a little tab on one side of it which will indicate polarity. So you make sure to get the plus connector of your speaker attached to the red or plus output here, and that way the system's all in phase. On your speaker side, your speakers probably want bare wires, or maybe they too have similar connectors like this if they're home theater speakers. And again, use of banana plugs makes that connection nice and neat and easy. And it might be most convenient just to purchase speaker wire with the appropriate connectors on it for your application. Now, if you have a more modern amplifier, like this one, right here, you'll see this amplifier accepts XLR connectors for its signal input, and over here has speak-on connectors for its audio output to the speakers. And this is most common these days, and it's my preference. Speak-on connectors are great. They look like one of these. And with a speak-on connector, you cannot get the polarity incorrect, and it's a locking connector, so when you insert it in and give it a little twist, it locks in place so it won't fall out accidentally. And they're great. This is an NL2 speaker connector, which means it carries 2 wires, which would be, for a left channel or for right channel. So each channel would have a connector like this that plug into the amplifier and latch in place. A lot of amplifiers will also support an NL4 connector. And so that's a connector that looks exactly like this, except that it has 4 conductors inside of it instead of 2. And with the 4 conductors, you could drive both your left and your right speaker just from one connector. And if you look at the back of this amplifier, there's some nomenclature by the connectors right here that lets you know that pins 1 and 2, the primary pins, go to left channel on this connector and right channel on the other connector. But one of these connectors also has pins 3 and 4, so it would support an NL4 4-conductor connector if you wanted to. And in that case, it would put pins 1 and 2 on one channel and 3 and 4 on the other channel. So with one connector, you could get both your right and your left channels. And so you could have just one connector with the wires of both speakers going into it if you wanted to, if that was convenient for you. Now on the speaker side, if you're using typical home theater type speakers, they're probably going to accept bare wires or possibly a banana plug type connection. And that's easy. If you're using Pro Sound speakers, the speaker itself may likely accept a speak-on connector. And in that case, getting a cable with speak-on connectors on both ends would be cool. Some Pro Sound speakers will take 1/4-inch plugs. And so you could get a cable that has speak-on one end and 1/4-inch plug on the other. And that's all you need to do to hook it up. Okay, so now that you've got your receiver connected to a converter box, which provides balanced output going to the input of the amplifier, and you've got your loudspeakers attached to the output of the amplifier, we're ready to go. So let's talk about order of powering things up and down, which is important if you want to protect your loudspeakers. What I would suggest that you do is first turn on your AV receiver. Wait a second or two for it to come up to power and settle out, and then turn on your power amplifier. The reason for this is if you turn on the power amplifier first and then turn on the receiver may put out a little click or spike of its outputs as it's turning on. And we don't want that little transient that comes out of the AV receiver to get amplified through your power amplifier and out to your speakers. So we don't want your speakers to go click or pop when you turn equipment on. So we're going to turn on the receiver first and let it settle down, and then turn on the power amplifier. And that way we shouldn't get any undue clicks or pops or noise through our speakers when the system comes up. And likewise, when we're turning things off, we make sure to turn off the power amplifier first, so that when we turn off the AV receiver second, any clicks or pops or noise that comes out of the AV receiver doesn't get amplified and sent out to your loudspeakers, which could potentially cause some damage. So I hope if you choose to add an amplifier to your home theater system, it delivers all the power that you need and makes things work better for you. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, and you're not a subscriber, well, I hope you make the choice to subscribe. And if you do subscribe, please hit that bell icon so you're notified when new stuff comes down. Your actions like subscribing, hitting the thumbs up, even double-clicking that old thumbs down if you feel the need, or leaving a comment. All of these interactions with the channel tell YouTube that people are enjoying this stuff, and it will encourage YouTube to suggest it to more folks, and that helps the channel grow. And I appreciate it. So thanks for stopping by, and I hope to see you again soon on another upcoming episode. Meanwhile, if you're interested in power amplification, check out the videos that are on this end screen here for more info.